today we're here to talk about Artful Breakdowns, the Comics of Art Spiegelman, which Lee edited with Georgiana Banita. Yes, I also have mine. Lee's holding up his. I also have mine here. It was just published by Mississippi as part of the Tom Inge series on comics artists. So I am going to dive in to our conversation today. First by asking Lee, if you want to start us off by talking a bit about how this collection came to be and sort of about this organizing idea of the Artful Breakdown. You want to kind of start us off there?
Yeah, I'd love to start there, and I can maybe give a little bit of my background also with Spiegelman and studying Spiegelman. I had been interested in Spiegelman from when I was an undergraduate at Cornell. I actually wrote my undergraduate honors thesis on mouse, right? So like I remember back in the late 90s doing a kind of deep dive into the scholarship around mouse. And so I'd always had a kind of interest in Spiegelman and his career. And I had a kind of a larger interest in the history of comics and thinking about the changing status of comics in the culture. And so around 2014, 2015, I had a conversation with Dave Mall, who was editing a series at the University Press of Mississippi called Critical Approaches to Comics Artists. And the idea was to do an edited collection on a major figure in the comics world. And no one had pitched him a book on Spiegelman, and so we had started talking, and eventually he hooked me up with Georgiana Banita, who ended up becoming my co-editor. And that kind of was the origin of the collection. So we put out a call for papers around 2015. And our idea was that like lots of people have studied mouse, a lot of people have written about mouse, and there was just a lot more work to do on Spiegelman beyond, and I mean, mouse is, important, but like there's just so much that he's done. And so that was the kind of organizing principle for the collection. And so that's kind of where it started. The title, Artful Breakdowns, was kind of meant to make a kind of statement about Spiegelman's career as a whole, thinking like what unifies all of these really interesting experiments, right? Like Spiegelman came up in the 60s in the underground in San Francisco. He did lots of sort of experimental comics, very formally innovative comics, and through sort of a series of pieces that he did and editing kind of jobs that he did, he came to sort of define a lot of the field of art comics. And so we thought that one thing that kind of characterizes his work across his whole career is this kind of interest in form, and this interest in sort of seeing what is specific about comics as a form, and then seeing how that breaks down or collapses. And so there are lots of puns I could talk about in the title that would sort of maybe be interesting, maybe not, but that's kind of where we started from with the collection.
So I had intended to ask, and I think you already started touching on this question of the kind of location of Spiegelman within certain kinds of fields, in the sense that because he's been so associated with mouse, and he's been studied a lot in the context of memory studies or Holocaust studies. And so I wanted to ask you to say a little bit about what it means to examine Spiegelman through the lens of comic studies, and sort of what his contributions to the medium are. You already started to suggest something about that. I don't know if this prompt gives you thoughts about other things you would like to say about what you feel like a collection like this one achieves
Yeah,
for the field?
absolutely. Right. Like, I guess what I would say to that question is that, like, Spiegelman, uh, you know, had a very, sort of long career before he became someone who academics wanted to write about. And his sort of way into the academy was very much through the fields that you've kind of enumerated, right? So, like, thinking about the Holocaust, memory studies, psychoanalytic studies of trauma. These are the way that scholars sort of brought Mauss into the academy, brought Spiegelman into the academy. And there are good reasons for studying Mauss and Spiegelman through those perspectives. But what it kind of misses is that Spiegelman always and first thinks of himself as a cartoonist, as far as I'm concerned, right? Like, he begins from an interest in comics, and then he pursues these different forms. And Mauss is an example of this toward the end of thinking about, like, what can comics do that it hasn't done already? What are the potentialities within the form that have yet to be explored? So, when I teach Mauss, I often will ask at the beginning of a class, like, how many of you have read this book? And almost all of the hands go up. And then the next question is, like, well, what's the context within which you have read this? And almost always it's as part of, like in some cases, like a high school unit on the Holocaust, for example. And so the pedagogical rationale is that, like, we're going to go to Mauss in order to get a kind of, a comic book history of the Holocaust, something simplified, something easy that we can give to teenagers so that they can begin to understand the complexity of this history. Whereas I kind of, tell them, after they've told me that, like, we're going to kind of approach this in a very different way. Like, we want to sort of begin with the idea that there's something formally interesting, formally complex going on in this book that isn't just about, transmitting information about the Holocaust in a highly digestible way. And so, this is sort of what I say in my comics classes in general. Like, you may have come here thinking you're going to have fun, but I promise you, you will have no fun. You will actually be forced to sort of read these books closely and in a way that maybe you're not used to or even comfortable with. So that, for me, is sort of like, this is kind of a scholarly analog to that move, where I want to say, like, you can't dissociate Spiegelman's work from his advocacy for comics, from his place in the history of comics, and from the kind of intensely formal concerns that drive him through his career.
So I'm not a Spiegelman scholar myself in the way that you are. So one of the things that I felt like I learned in reading this collection was a lot more about the expansiveness of his collaborations, not only with other comics writers, which I knew about, but working in a range of media, theater, music. And I was also particularly taken with like a more thorough understanding of his collaboration with Francois Mouly, his wife. And I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about how you see collaboration functioning in his career, or functioning in the context of these investments that you started to elaborate on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess I would answer in maybe two ways. Like, one has to do with his collaborations with other artists, with other media, illustrating novels, putting on sort of theatrical productions, working with visual artists who are doing a different kind of work than comics. And in that case, like, one thing maybe that's interesting about Spiegelman's sense of comics is that, like, he's both invested, and this will come up maybe later, but, like, he's both invested in the kind of a form of medium specificity, but then also in sort of denying that medium specificity in the same breath. So he sort of thinks of comics as, there are lots of definitions of comics, but, like, for Spiegelman, the mixture of text and images is very vital to what he thinks is important about the medium. and so he's always or in many cases, emphasizing a kind of a hybridity to the form, and he does work that kind of pushes that hybridization further. And so that is, I think, one of the places where a lot of his collaborations are coming out of. The other thing to say is, like his primary lifelong collaborator is his wife, Francoise Mouly, who's the art editor, I think she still is, of the New Yorker, and who really did a lot to revitalize, the covers, of the New Yorker, starting, like in the 90s when they started, both started working at the New Yorker. And so, this is one dimension of his career that I think is underappreciated. Spiegelman is an artist who has produced, interesting works that, we all might interpret and think about and teach, but he's also kind of really important as an editor and an organizer. Like he, put out some of the most important periodicals in, comics history. He was a talent scout. He would find young, innovative artists and give them a shot to find an audience. And, he, sort of helped launch many really, really vital, really, really important careers. And all of this was not done alone. Like a lot of this had to do with Francoise Mouly's kind of, dedicated editorial labor. She was in a way like a much more, she was like a much better editor than he was, because she wasn't herself primarily a cartoonist. And so her, if one cartoonist is editing another cartoonist, there's a kind of ego, a set of egos clashing, I think. And then she found a way to work with a lot of cartoonists and help them find a voice on the page in a way that I think has been like underappreciated at least among scholars. And certain people have written about it, but like not systematically in the way that they should.
So in your answer to that question, where you were talking a little bit about medium specificity, you were touching on things that you discuss in your own contribution to the collection, where that essay is about Spiegelman's turn to writing comics for kids, and the way that turn sort of speaks to his ambivalence about the market, and also his interest in certain modernist values, one of which you talk about in terms of like these questions about medium specificity or autonomy or what have you. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about that argument that you have in your own particular piece, since if we imagine that sort of his career begins with taking comics away from the realm of being understood as something that's just for kids, what does it mean for him to turn to comics for kids and toon books and so forth? You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, like that essay was a lot of fun to write, right? So like for my own contribution, I was interested in the fact that after Mouse, Spiegelman did a lot to sort of run away from Mouse. That is to say, like he didn't want to be thought of only through the lens of that one monumental work. And so he pursued a lot of really interesting, and again, like understudied projects. And one of those projects is the formation of Toon Books, which was like a publisher that would publish comics for kids. He himself published a lot of works that were directed toward, to younger readers of comics. And he also published a couple of anthologies called Little Lit that were kind of collecting, again, comics that were directed toward kids. And, he had his own, a comic of his own that he put into the first of those anthologies. And I guess what was interesting to me about that was first the way that this choice it sort of reverses or ironizes the kind of cliche that, right, like comics aren't just for kids anymore. Right? Like there's a funny Onion article that sort of is like, says like, oh, critics realize comics are not for kids. They announced for the 30,000th time. You know what I mean? Like people are constantly discovering that comics aren't just for kids. A lot of the paratextual apparatus around Spiegelman's own writing sort of ironically engaged with those kind of statements. So like, Raw would say, this is for, this is a book for, this is a book for adults, or this is a book not just for kids, in somewhat ironized tones. But then, there's this kind of explicit and overt turn toward comics for kids. And, that is individually interesting in terms of Spiegelman's career, but because he founded this, institution, Toon, I kind of was interested in like what that was about. And I kind of looked into the kind of materials that Toon published. One of the things that they published was a guidebook for how to integrate their comics into the Common Core curriculum, right? And so there's this sort of explicit turn to the incorporation of comics into the classroom, a rationalization for that move in terms of certain curricular priorities. And so that was kind of the starting point for me in thinking about like, what does it mean to create, comics for kids overtly? Is the creation of these comics meant as a kind of stepping stone toward grapheme-based forms of literacy, right? Like we read comics until we can move, graduate to novels and books without pictures, or as my chapter suggests, what would it mean to think of like the reading of comics for kids as a stepping stone toward reading comics for adults, right? And that's the kind of the path that I think Spiegelman and Toon Books is pursuing. Like they're making some gestures toward the idea, okay, well, this is going to teach you how to read real novels, in some of their published materials, but really there's this is the joke in a way, you can do a close reading of some of these comics for kids and you can see the way that they fit into a certain formal conception of comics that Spiegelman and his collaborators have developed over the years. So that's the kind of, project, that was sort of what was exciting to me about it. And, like, I also was like, someone needs to write about this, so someone has to write about these comics for kids, and pretty much no scholars have really written about it in this way. And so I was like, I'll do that for the collection.
You took on that burden, that mantle. I noticed that as I was moving on to the question about your essay, that Oren had posted had asked a question in the chat that I think speaks to the question about collaboration that we were talking about before. So maybe just to make sure that we're allowing ample time for questions, I'll repeat Oren's question, and that can be our way of opening up the floor to folks to ask questions, and maybe I'll throw in another here or there if time allows. So Oren asked, has Spiegelman collaborated with other artists or writers where he wrote only the text or did only images? And then that was part of the style of collaboration. Is that right, Oren? Or you can go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just elaborate my question a little bit more, thinking it through. This might be a really kind of trite observation for people who work in studying comics and graphic novels, but Christina's question just made me think about someone like Grant Morrison, who actually is a writer and is really known as a writer, and he works with a number of different illustrators. And then you have someone like Art Spiegelman and a number of other people who, like Emil Furist, who really are known both for their art and for their writing, and in almost this kind of Hitchcockian auteur way, where they control all of that kind of interchange and dynamic. And so I'm just curious how much Spiegelman might have actually worked in that other kind of territory of like collaborating with other artists or writers in a way that creates another dynamic. And maybe I was just kind of wondering if this is a distinction that people who study graphic novels ever make. You know, those people who, those artists or creators in that medium who just concentrate on just the art or the writing, and then someone like Spiegelman, who I think is is especially known for having this vision that accompanies both or kind of synthesizes both.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, the answer is that Spiegelman has done a lot of things with a lot of collaborators. You know, he's illustrated books, you know, so those aren't really comics in which, you know, someone wrote the comics and then he illustrated them. But there are lots of cases where like he'll, you know, like illustrate something that someone else has written. He writes prose, you know, like prolifically. I mean, like he's written many important essays on the history of comics. I don't know that he's written like a script or something for someone else's comic, as far as I know. What I will say is that like there's, you know, you talk about the example of Grant Morrison, and what I would say is that like there's like the field of comics is divided. The way I think of it, between a kind of there's like the mainstream industry in the US, which is to say, you know, the kind of comics that are being published out of, you know, like Marvel and DC, and they have their own history of production, which is to say, like there's a moment where, you know, it's work for hire, you have someone doing the penciling, you know, there's sort of like a factory model, like someone does the script, someone does the pencil, someone does the ink, someone does the color, someone does the lettering.
Right, a real division of labor.
There's a division of labor, right? Like, and strong editorial oversight over that process. And that, you know, like we were talking about Vertigo like the other day, like yesterday, and like, you know, that, you know, the move to creator ownership within the mainstream industry changed a lot of those work practices. The rise of like celebrity comics artists and even celebrity comics writers, you know, disrupted the idea that like, you know, every worker in that division of labor is interchangeable. But Spiegelman's coming out of a different tradition in that, like, you know, he has done work for hire, you know, like, I mean, he did like, right, like he famously did like the Garbage Pail Kids, and he did other kind of things for Topps. But like, he's coming more out of a kind of art comics tradition that sees the work of writing and drawing and even coloring in some cases as a kind of unified activity done by a single individual. So, you know, when he does these collaborations, he's not really I don't know what, the cake isn't being kind of sliced in the same way as it is in the industrial model of comics production, if that makes sense. And so I don't think really there are straightforward cases of like, I wrote a script for a comic book, here artists go and pencil it for me. But there are lots of cases where, you know, Spiegelman writes prose, and in some cases he only does illustrations, and then in other cases he is doing things that are more conceptual and editorial. So anyway, that would be a long answer to your question.
Shawn, you posted a link to the Wild Party. Did you have anything that you wanted to sort of add to what Lee had just said there about?
No, yeah, Lee characterizes it the way I would, which is that Spiegelman comes from the underground tradition for his initial work, and that's a really auteur and solo artist approach. And then some of those underground artists become interested in like the editorial and combination part of it. So like Crumb does the same thing with some of his edited comics, where he's bringing together a bunch of artists, but a lot of them are really interested in the sort of solo production model. But in later instances, like for example, the Wild Party, there are some Spiegelman things that are based on prior texts or in combination with something. It's just that I don't know of any specifics where he's drafted something for another artist in particular, though there are some hybrid things that have come along, like illustration work, and he's done a bunch of like murals and this kind of stuff that obviously involves a bunch of people. It's just that his art tends to be prime.
Are there
it's
other
kind of
questions?
interesting. Oh,
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I don't want to dominate the conversation, but it's just kind of interesting then to kind of think of someone like Neil Gaiman, right? Who you could actually argue comes from as yet another third tradition of, I mean, he's a fiction writer. He writes novels, books, print books, and has quite a big, visibility that way. But, he then goes into Sandman. And so he would be kind of version of Grant Morrison, but someone who doesn't come out of that kind of commercial division of labor, but just who actually comes in with his own kind of creative artist, auteur kind of bona fide, but collaborates, I think, in comics with the whole. Well, I mean, Sandman actually has a lot of different illustrators, right? It's interesting. It just kind of clarified for me the different kind of maybe work practices that then go into these kind of different people who really do have this, real presence in comics. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like, I mean, this is a history I'm very interested in, and literally I'm writing something on this right now, thinking through, I'm contributing to an edited collection that is in the same series, but about Karen Berger, who is the founding editor of Vertigo Comics. And again, actually like Francois Mouly, her contribution, Berger's contribution to comics has been underappreciated because it has come in the form of editorial labor. And, there's sort of obviously also a kind of gendered division of labor there too, where it's sort of like historically, a lot of women have done what you could think of as the kind of editorial reproductive labor of like managing big egos and making sure books get produced on time, and going to upper management and ironing through all these problems. And the case of Neil Gaiman and Vertigo is a kind of interesting hybrid zone between the kind of auteurist tradition that comes out of the underground and the corporate model. And there's a kind of middle zone of what I would characterize as like the creator-owned comics movement starting in the 80s and 90s, which was very influenced by Spiegelman. That is to say, they saw the success of Mouse and they were like, look at all this critical attention that all of these comics are getting. But they themselves, like Neil Gaiman, was never part of it necessarily like the same scene. And he's coming out of the UK as well, and there's a whole separate history of UK comics, and the influence of Alan Moore and like periodicals that were not circulating in the US but that were still influential. So Gaiman is an interesting case, and I kind of put him in this like from a kind of sociological perspective of comics, like I put him in that kind of that zone of like corporate imprints that sought some of the prestige that comics was gaining in the 80s and 90s.
Scott, I saw that you had
Yeah.
your hand up before. Do you want to
So I was wondering if either Lee or Shawn, thinking about Spiegelman in terms of what he is doing as not strictly memoir, not strictly illustration of history, like something like Mouse being a critical commentary as well. So contrasting it to like Persepolis or to March, for example, where the goal is a sort of historical representation, whereas with Spiegelman, it seems like he's really attempting not just to provide a visceral sort of recapturing, but also criticize, aspects of those historical events. Whether you wanted to address if you see what he's doing as something different than memoir in that regard.
Yeah, I'll make a short remark, and then Shawn, you should also give your perspective on this. Like, I mean, I see what one of the things that Mouse does is sort of turn its gaze back upon its own success in the second volume, right? And so there's a way in which the first volume is very much interested in presenting a history, presenting a kind of family memoir. And because the book was serialized and raw, and because the first volume came out, you know, to great fanfare, there was sort of a moment of like, you know, feedback from the world, right? Like where Spiegelman, even before he finished Mouse, began to grapple with the implications of the success of the book. And so he sort of begins to like metatextually kind of turn his gaze inward, and which is something that, like, you know, March does mean, I've taught March, you know, and like to some degree it's self-conscious of itself as a media product. It's, you know, drawing attention to questions of mediation and thinking about what comics might do for the historiography of civil rights that, you know, say other forms of documentary and history might not be able to do. But it's not nearly as self-reflexive as Mouse is. It's much more straightforwardly comfortable with being in a classroom and pedagogically connecting to, you know, some group of students. And then Persepolis is, I mean, you know, like it's a remarkable book, but it's also not self-conscious in the same way as Mouse. And I attribute that maybe partly to the fact that it's coming out of a French tradition where like comics has less to prove, you know, like comics is accepted much more warmly in the French context, in the French language context, than it is in the US. And so Persepolis also doesn't have that kind of fraught relation to its own, the possibility of its widespread adoption and success. So that's kind of how I would answer your question. I don't know if Shawn, you have another perspective on it.
Yeah, I agree, especially with the last point that the American tradition at the time, and remember Mouse is being serialized into the 80s, and so it's coming into it's being tipped into raw as a little pamphlet at first. It really doesn't have a kind of clear home the way that the Franco-Belgian tradition would have given it, right? It was easier to write a history of any particular event or a memoir in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and we just didn't have that as a format for quite a while in the United States. And I think one of the things that I try to teach when I teach a couple chapters of Mouse, I don't usually teach both volumes anymore because I like to do other things with the time of my classes, but is that it's a really constructed work, and Spiegelman, and especially with Hilary Shute, has been really interested in showing its construction. So like all the production materials of Mouse are just like everywhere. They're in all the collections. There's a book called Meta Mouse that's about the making of Mouse that has all the interviews and has all the like drafts. And I think that's really been an influence in how I think about it. The Spiegelman show that I talked very briefly about at the MoMA in my chapter in this volume is a display of draft work, right? Like Spiegelman's really interested, especially in that period, in showing how this thing became what it was, not just that it arrived like fully formed. And I think that's really important for how to situate it, which when it's often taught like in high schools is taught as like a bound book that just exists, right? Just it has come to be, whereas it actually helped make that possible. Like the actual process of making Mouse come out made the possibility of books like Mouse, which now March can just be, right? There can be 3 volumes of March that just get published. And that's not to knock later works, it's just important for the situation in its kind of historical art, for me at least.
Bob, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, it's kind of a follow-up to Shawn's mention of, you know, when the book is taught in high school. So increasingly, it's difficult to teach this book in high school. I mean, that's what I'm picking up. So I'm wondering if that's addressed in the collection, A. B, I'm wondering if it's a good thing if it's difficult to teach in a high school. Maybe students will want to read it, you know, as opposed to things that they're forced to read. So I'd just like your thoughts on the kind of increasing efforts to keep this book out of public schools.
Yeah, I mean, I will say because of the temporality of like academic publishing, we were not able to address that directly in our intro or in any of the pieces that we published. You know, like we started in 2015, and a lot of these efforts to ban it have been more recent. And I, you know, like, I don't know what to make of it, to be honest. You know, like it's hard for me to sort of we can find anecdotes of particular books being banned that are, quite high profile, and there are, statistics that are gathered about, which books tend to be banned more often, and in what numbers. But I just don't have a good answer about how much it's been banned, what the rationale is for its banning, whether this marks a change in its status. Those just seems to me that it's still highly canonical, widely taught. Many, of my students know about it, even if they haven't read it. And so it's, the truth is I don't have a good answer to your question for all those reasons. I don't know if Shawn, you have more sense than I do.
Sorry, I don't know a lot about the dynamics of that particular work, other than the sort of general reporting that you hear about various bands that just wrap up everything under very spurious logic much of the time. It's not as though the content is actually the question, it's just that the categories are the problem.
Right.
Specific.
I think that our students will know about the book. It's students coming out of Florida, for example, who may not know about the book, but they might hear that it's been banned and want to read it.
Yeah, I hope they do. The controversies around the book, have maybe changed historically. Like the initial mouse metaphor used within Mouse was itself very controversial. It instantiates, racist, kind of a racist visual logic, and attaches, these visual categories to real stories, to real people, right? So that was something controversial. The representation of Polish people as pigs was controversial when it came out. And so, if this book is being banned, say, as you say, in Florida, it's interesting to me to sort of, I would like to learn more about what the rationale is, if it's just because things like Fun Home, right? People want to ban Fun Home because it, supposedly, has graphic representations of sex, right? And obviously, that's not the real reason they want to ban it. But in the case of Mouse, I'd be very curious to sort of see the individual cases and see what the rationale is for banning it.
Right.
I wonder if Bob was hinting more about the banning, that it would be a change. I think, correct me, Bob, but it would be the opposite of the reasons that you're suggesting, Lee. In a way that the racist visual representation would have been would have violated some politically correct sensibility. And I think today, if it was being banned in Florida, it would be banned for being politically correct. Does that make sense? This is so I think it's just it's sort of interesting to see how books are picked up for banning, depending on the politics. I had a sort of a larger question, if I could ask. Maybe this is not a fair question because I'm not. It's not about Spiegelman, but about graphic novels in general. And I'm wondering if Linu is still here, if this is a question she would like to ask someone working with graphic narratives. But I was thinking about the kind of in your answers and in the questions, the kind of difference that let's say between Spiegelman's works and let's say the Marvel Comics stuff. There's a kind of built-in reflection and what one could call a kind of metacritical sort of built-in metacritical, I don't know, reflection or critical for comics. And I was thinking about I'm teaching a class right now, my usual class on South Asian, African, and Caribbean, and I'm going to end the class with a graphic novel from the continent of Africa. But in sort of doing my research, one of the things that I've kept coming across is sort of the availability of graphic narratives across the board, especially from the Middle East and North Africa. So less from from West and East Africa and more from North Africa, and primarily as a kind of way to address the questions of Islam, refugees, and the hijab, right? So those comics seem to have a similar kind of they seem to have a kind of a, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, like a kind of, they're constantly battling with this, like, the kind of representation of the plight of refugees, right? But also then a critical commentary about sort of a larger global politics, right? And then a kind of critical reflection on the role of the graphic novel itself, right? As using a kind of visual poetics, graphics to think about an always already visually powerful event like the refugees, and sort of how does that work? Like, what does it mean to use the graphic novel as a way to visually capture that which sort of dominates our visual field every day? So I'm just wondering whether you had, I don't have a question, but wondering whether you have a comment on the kind of larger sort of the place of graphic narratives in general in the popular and critical imagination, the way in which graphic novels lend themselves to these multiple layers, much in a way that a great novel would, but in a kind of compact form, just in general, as a long.
I mean, there are a lot of kind of ways, I'd love to, if there are particular graphic novels that you are teaching regularly, I would love to hear about them. I mean, I may or may not be familiar with the specific examples that you would give, but I will say that there, traditionally, and this isn't a good tradition necessarily, but like traditionally the comics world, say if we think of like global comics, if you were like, I've taught like a global comics course, right? And like the traditional way of dividing up the world of comics would be to say, well, comics essentially, I mean, this is a point of controversy. Yeah, does comics start with Rudolph Tuffler, or does it start American, newspaper strips, right? Are comics essentially, American or not? Like that's a sort of a, not a very interesting conversation at a certain point. But the traditional way of dividing up the world of comics has been to say, okay, there's like a U.S. tradition, the Franco-Belgian tradition, and then there's the manga, right? Like there's the Japanese. And I think one of the things Spiegelman has done, and one of the things that one of his legacies that you might be noticing in the comics that you're teaching is that he very explicitly was seeking to produce a kind of, I don't want to be global about it, but like kind of a world comics, like he was trying to find artists from all over to publish in raw. And one of the impacts of Mouse was that it had this, for the first time, like, international circulation, right? That's to say, like, Persepolis is influenced by the example of Mouse, because he's married to Francois Mouly. He's sort of able to move back and forth between Europe and the U.S. And I think there's a kind of, at this point, you could call it a kind of tradition of comics that are very consciously trying to speak to issues of global significance, right? So one of my favorite, artists, cartoonists is Joe Sacco.
Oh yes, I love Joe Sacco.
His work is, I think, very consciously thinking like about what is it, what does it mean to do journalism in comics, right? The first thing to say is that the comic page takes a long time to draw. So the idea that the comic book page, is going to give you news is subverted right from the get-go by the form itself. And so the point of the matter is that there's this like a really vibrant new space that isn't, fitting into the traditional three-part division of world comics that I think is emerging, and histories of that world space. Honestly, I mean, I'm not like as fluent in the scholarship as I should be. I don't think people have written those histories yet. And I think, like, if you're a graduate student thinking like, what should I be doing in the comics field? I think like thinking about global comics, world comics is an exciting area people are working in, but there's like so much more to do.
I think Linu is the person, right, Linu? I don't know if Linu, you want to say anything?
Hello, thanks for the response and also for the question, Professor Ray. But instead of responding to that, like I had another question to add to this. So I believe this is also related to the ability of the comics form, its capability to represent the unrepresentable that many scholars have talked about. And with respect to Art Spiegelman's work, uh, uh, it is known that his work is basically about this difficult act of witnessing. And Hilary Shute has famously talked about how in his work there is this, while it pictures historical violence, there is a certain kind of balancing uh, the violence that is inherent in, say, images in themselves, and uh, how he has been able to use those images in non-exploitative ways. So my question would be, um, say, I mean, what would be the limitations of the comics medium, so to say? Because we've talked about, in reference to Art Spiegelman's work, um, how, because in say, traditional conventional novels, quote unquote, uh, the verbal medium, where we only use the verbal medium, they talk about the difficulty of representation, and comics medium sort of providing a way to represent the unrepresentable, but still, uh, I mean, uh, how successful the comics medium is in balancing that violence that is inherent in the verbal medium, in images.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there would be two levels of my answer. Like one would be just a generic point, that like every medium has its limitations. Every medium has what you could call its, affordances. That is to say, it's good or tends toward certain forms of representation, and maybe it has a more difficult time with other kinds of representation. And so speaking at that kind of general level, you could say, for instance, that like, comics might have a certain difficulty doing what the novel can do. If we want to think of one of the novel's strengths as representing, some analog of consciousness, we might critique that representation, but it's harder to kind of get inside a perspective in a medium like comics, you might say. But then, comics has its advantages as well, which is to say, it still is, let's say it's still arm's length reading, right? That is to say, you get the impact of the visual, but the intimacy of a kind of reading experience, right? So it's different in that way from cinema, right? So we might speak very abstractly, about, every medium and what comics, can do in relation to those other media. But then I guess the next thing I would say is that, like, individual artists, conscious of those limitations, try to break the forms that they're using. And one of the things that, characterizes Spiegelman is that, like, he is trying to find the limits, like kind of what you described, like the limits of what comics can do, right? And so you can see across his career, and I don't want to just center this on Mouse, like you see him asking a question like, in some of the pieces published in Breakdowns, his first collection, like, could comics be used as a medium for writing an essay? That is to say, what would the comics essay look like, right? And so he has this exploration of psychoanalysis and jokes that he publishes that became influential to later cartoonists like Scott McCloud and so on. And Spiegelman discovers that, like, comics is a very powerful medium for the visual essay. And so, this is not a way that comics had been used before that point. And so I would say that, like, there's this tension between a kind of medium level set of affordances and discoveries that artists like Spiegelman can make by pushing against those perceived limitations.
Right. Thank you so much.
So we're pretty near 1 o'clock, but probably have room for one last question if somebody hasn't been able to ask their question. Good.
I have a question. I'd like to ask
For
Shawn.
yourself?
No, for Shawn. I want to ask Shawn a question.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, so can you just tell us more about your essay? And, you know, this book was long in production, and so I would love to hear you talk more about how the essay seems to you now in retrospect and what you're working on these days.
That's a good question. At a certain point, I'm not sure I could have even summarized what that essay was. And then I came back to it. And I was like, oh yeah, I think I still believe that. That's probably still true. Time is weird, and the pandemic has not been good for my memory of when things happen. So the essay is about Spiegelman's early experimental and critical work, which all predates Mouse. He had a lot of individual small pieces and lots of underground comics. And then had Breakdowns, which was his collection of like large format. It's like a big book compared to its contemporaries. And then went on to edit Arcade and Raw in particular, which are two very different kinds of comics journals. One is an underground style, and one is like an art magazine style. And I compared his sort of juxtapositional moves across those works. What was he actually putting next to each other? In comic studies, juxtaposition and sequentiality are really key formal ideas. Like almost everybody follows the idea that there's some forms of juxtaposition. But I was really interested in how he's actually doing it as a meta move at each of those moments. What does he actually think makes an argument, puts together as a collection? And, you know, by the time he gets to the point where the MoMA exhibit comes out, the big high and low exhibit in 1990, he writes a big critique piece of it for Art Forum, right? He's all about juxtaposing what he thinks is a proper argument for comics and comics art, as opposed to this kind of institutional one. And so I was trying to trace an arc of that outside of the Mouse context for how we might understand the sort of, and I call it modernist juxtaposition, the kind of what becomes the totality of each of those points. Because we don't have a good vocabulary for this, especially in the editorial and critical work that comics artists do. Lee is writing an essay for a collection I'm editing on Karen Berger, and we're trying to figure out how to talk well about comics editorial practices. And there's just not a great scholarship of this. It's often hidden from the world of institutional narratives. So as someone pointed out in the chat much earlier, Stan Lee proposes himself as like the lead editor of Marvel for decades, but actually didn't do the editorial work at Marvel for most of that period. So we lost all the notes about who did all the work, basically, right? And we've tried to reconstruct that. We're working on that in a lot of ways. And I tried to write in that chapter in particular about what I thought was Spiegelman's kind of unified effort to explore those different categories, but under this language of juxtaposition and positionality with regard to the kind of content he was trying to get to. Hopefully that was clear.
Thank you. Yeah.
That was excellent. Thank you very much, Shawn. Lee, are you frozen right now?
No, I'm just
okay. You're just sitting there letting it soak in. Okay. Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming today and listening to this conversation, which has been really fascinating. I'm so glad that you came, Shawn. I haven't seen you in years. Shawn and I went to graduate school together.
We did go to graduate school together.
But he's younger than me, so he looks better. But in any case, thank you very much, everybody, and have a wonderful weekend, and congratulations, Lee and Shawn.